Immanuel Kant, uh, if he were alive today, to take a look at all these different neuroscientific research programs that are setting out to explain consciousness as though it were some kind of brain mechanism, Kant would be slamming his head against the table because of how metaphysically confused that is.
Matt Segall, what I'm most interested in understanding is what are the key pieces of evidence that make Matt Segall, interdisciplinary scholar and philosopher, convinced that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe? Where does that story start for you?
Evidence is, in our time thought of as, because it's a scientific age, we think of evidence in terms of empirical measurement. Can I record this on a camera somehow or on some kind of detector? Can I then transform the signals, the data that I've observed from something tangible in the world into some kind of mathematical model, and then I can make predictions about it, and then go and see if those predictions are confirmed by the next observation that I make. And that kind of scientific measurement and modeling is I think, a really powerful set of methods. But there's more to evidence, to what might count as evidence, than just what can be measured, which is why consciousness is an interesting question at all. It seems rather to be both entirely intangible, and it doesn't weigh anything. You can't see it. And yet, on the other hand, it's pervasive. There is nothing that we could measure or observe that doesn't presuppose its presence. We have to be conscious before we can observe anything else. And so it's nowhere to be found, and yet there's nothing else to be found that doesn't already require it.
Yes.
Right. And so, but, the way you phrase the question about consciousness being a fundamental property, that already kind of gives us an abstract picture of this phenomenon, let's call it. Even that's not an adequate term for it, because it's also the noumenon, in the sense that consciousness is always going to be on both sides of these dichotomies. And so what counts as evidence? Well, our own first-person experience, our own awareness, is the primary evidence that we have for the existence of consciousness. And there's a whole tradition of philosophical reflection that understands consciousness in this sense as something transcendental. So it's not just a phenomenon. In other words, Immanuel Kant, if he were alive today, to take a look at all these different neuroscientific research programs that are setting out to explain consciousness as though it were some kind of brain mechanism, Kant would be slamming his head against the table because of how metaphysically confused that is. So consciousness is this transcendental condition, and whatever the structure and dynamics of consciousness are, they're what makes science possible. And so Kant's question, which is where I would want to start, as in terms of what is the evidence for consciousness and why it might be something, you said, fundamental. I think we have to approach it as the condition for the possibility of scientific knowledge. And if scientific knowledge of nature is possible, that tells us something important about what consciousness is. That consciousness is imbued with a kind of intelligence, a kind of agency, right? Because to do science, it's a purposeful activity. You're taking an interest in something called the truth. That already presupposes a whole bunch of stuff that science itself can't prove, that science itself can't go out and measure and model. Measurement and modeling is possible because of consciousness. So what is consciousness? It's not a scientific question in the sense of measuring and modeling things. It's a philosophical question, right? And so it's fundamental in the same sense, for the same reason that, for science to understand itself and its own conditions of possibility, we have to leave science and start to do something else, which we could talk about phenomenology, we could talk about speculative metaphysics, we could talk about meditation and various spiritual practices. There are a whole set of different ways to inquire into what this mystery called consciousness is.
What's your general belief? What when you hear the word consciousness throughout your career, you've been building this model of what it is. What is your most up to date idea of what you think consciousness is?
Well, again, it's a big word that people use in different ways, and it might be annoying for me to say this, but uh, I think nowadays, because traditional religion is, at least in the academic world, not taken very seriously, um, we need new words for what traditional religions would refer to as God. And I think consciousness is actually a decent candidate, at least for starting a different kind of conversation about what it would require to really understand consciousness. Because again, it's not just it's not an object out in nature that science can study in the way that it might try to study any other natural phenomenon. And so how do we relate to it? Well, we relate to it uh, always already as a self relation, because the evidence, again, that we have for consciousness is our own first person experience, is our own sense of being able to uh, share a horizon of experience with others, and so it's not just my private experience that I have evidence of, it's my experience of being attuned to others and sharing a sort of intersubjective field. And when you study that, you're not studying the third person objects out in nature that science can measure and model. You're studying your own intentionality, your own will, your own beliefs, and the process by which you become more or less aware of yourself, your own frustrations, your sense of guilt for not having behaved. All of this stuff uh, comes up, which usually when you do science, you can just bracket. You don't need to worry about, am I a good person, or what should I have for lunch, or like, what do I want to do with my life? These aren't questions that come up when you're just measuring nature out there, but because they do come up when you study consciousness, I think it's important to recognize that there's a spiritual side to it. There's at least a psychological side to it. It's all of a sudden these existential issues arise, and uh, there's a way in which you're involved in what you're trying to understand. Whereas in most of natural science, you leave yourself out. You can't do that anymore when you study consciousness. If you're seriously studying consciousness in the broader sense that I'm talking about, not if you're confused like so much neuroscience is today about. I mean, neuroscientists do great work, but I think the confusion is around imagining that some kind of brain mechanism would be able to explain consciousness. We can study the brain to understand how to manipulate consciousness, what the physiological conditions of consciousness are, but we're not going to explain where it comes from by studying the brain, because it doesn't come from the brain. The brain's a condition, but not a condition for consciousness, but not a producer of it, I would say. So that's where I've gotten. I don't pretend to know what consciousness is, because again, I think that's the wrong question to ask. The question to ask, if you want to understand consciousness, is also, who am I? And I can't answer that for you. So we're always going to be engaged in a very different type of inquiry when we explore consciousness, because I don't know that there's a final answer to the question.
Yeah. I love the difference in response I get to that kind of question if I'm speaking to a neuroscientist versus a philosopher. It's it's an entirely different response, and that's why I love to speak to both, because you get so many different perspectives. Like, it's fun to hear you say with confidence that the brain doesn't produce consciousness, when still sort of the leading neuroscience theories, ideas would be that the brain, the body, the biological system generate consciousness, produce consciousness emerges from it. There's different ways of phrasing it that annoy different camps depending on what you believe. But why would you be confident that the brain doesn't produce consciousness?
Well, the brain can perform all of the biological functions that it performs without consciousness. Or if a neuroscientist wants to say that consciousness has, and there are some who would, that consciousness has like a downward causal effect on the body, and so that there's a bottom-up emergence of consciousness through neurophysiological activity, but then somehow when it does emerge, this global emergent property called consciousness is able to, like, decisions matter. Like the consciousness is actually having a causal effect on the behavior of the body.
Yeah.
Then metaphysically, I have a lot of questions about how that is possible and what is meant by causality. But I think to speak to the neuroscientists who would say it's just epiphenomenal, consciousness has no causal power, there's no emergent whole that has downward causative effects or anything. Then I start to wonder how it ever could have evolved, because there's no way for it to get selected for, right? And so there's those two positions, right? The emergentists who would say consciousness is real and has some downward causative effect, even if it is produced by the brain. And then neuroscientists who would say, oh, no, it's just an epiphenomenon. I think for the epiphenomenalists, it's like, okay, this couldn't have evolved. Where did it come from? Why does it exist? Why are we conscious? Some of them will be eliminativists, and they'll just say, well, we're not actually conscious. We have words that we use that we think refer to this consciousness thing, but we're just confused. And that's a real, eliminative materialism. It can be a sophisticated position, but it seems hard for me to take it seriously because of how experientially inadequate it is. It's like, no,
Yes.
we're aware there's something happening here. There's a mystery here. You can't just dismiss it. But then, in the epiphenomenalists, yeah, you understand why I think there's something missing there. For the emergentists, though, when you say that the brain produces consciousness, and there are, a variety of different attempts to try to tell a causal story about how that emergence might occur, but to my mind, I've never actually seen an explanation. I've seen a lot of category errors from my perspective as a philosopher, a lot of category errors, but how you could actually go from matter understood as completely devoid of anything like purposiveness or agency or interiority or feeling, to all of a sudden gain this capacity for inner awareness and affect and emotion. And there's an ontological difference there. It's not a difference of degree. It's not like if you arranged a bunch of material bodies in the right way, all of a sudden something like consciousness is going to come out of that. How is the arrangement of any very complicated arrangement of matter suddenly going to be anything more than just a complicated arrangement of matter and become aware of itself? Like, there's a huge gap there, and I've never really seen a good explanation for how to leap the gap. So I'm led, to this more panexperientialist or panpsychist view, and there's a whole variety of different kinds of panpsychism, some of which I disagree with, but there's a certain tradition, process philosophy that comes out of, in the 20th century, people like Whitehead. I think we could go back to Schelling in the 19th century in his philosophy of nature, which was also of this sort of flavor of panpsychism where there's a process dimension to it, and we understand experience not as something produced by certain arrangements of matter magically, but rather experience is just what's going on inside of material processes at every scale. Wherever there is some kind of energetic transmission occurring, there's also an experiential transmission occurring, some kind of Whitehead calls them vector feelings or prehensions. There's a flow of feeling through the world, and when we talk about causality and we measure it in terms of and calculate it in terms of energy, that's our objective external description of what on the inside is something more like feeling. We could talk about consciousness, being fundamental, or we could be a little bit more fine-grained about the words that we use and say, well, consciousness does require a very complicated nervous system maybe even language, or some degree of symbolic capacity, whereas experience or feeling or affect might not be conscious in that sense that it's self-reflective, but still there's awareness. There's a Whitehead would say self-enjoyment at every level of physical organization. So because I think these frames, whether it's the eliminativist, the epiphenomenalist, the emergentist, each one has major theoretical problems, I think. I found myself sort of backed into panpsychism as the best solution to those problems, right? So consciousness isn't produced in the brain. Consciousness and matter are just two sides of the same coin, and we need to go back to Descartes, where the dualism happened, because it's at that point that what we thought of as nature was severed from our own inner experience of being alive. And then we went about trying to model this half of reality that we'd severed ourselves from, as though that could produce us when we'd already left ourselves out of it from the beginning, right? And so we need a different scientific philosophy of nature behind science than the Cartesian dualism. Because a lot of these neuroscientists would say, of course, Descartes was wrong. There's no dualism. I'm a materialist. Well, but your materialism is beginning from that, after that Cartesian split. You're accepting Descartes' definition of nature, when we need to really rewind and question whether mind and nature should have been separated conceptually in the first place.
Right. Really well explained. I think really well broken apart. I joke that the longer I do the podcast, the more radical I get. And, 100 episodes later, I certainly start falling into the panpsychist camp. Who knows, maybe earlier. I think I started off the podcast being very strongly materialist. I studied neuroscience in college. That was sort of the only framework that was remotely taken seriously in my college, in my degree. I remember, I think panpsychism was literally given 2 minutes in one of my integrative neuroscience lectures in like third year, I think. And he literally kind of just threw up the slide as panpsychism at the top, and he was like, "There's no evidence for this. We'll move on." And that was not even exaggerating. That was literally the rundown that we got of that set of ideas. So I didn't know anything about it in college. But as I talked to more and more people, it gets harder and harder to draw the line in the sand of where consciousness is and where it isn't. And I, like you, very much struggle, like everyone, struggle with this idea of like how you get from matter to experience. But I think where I am at the moment is consciousness did emerge, but it emerged very, very, very early on in very extremely simple biological systems when they started integrating information in their environment and having a subjective perspective, a view, an agency in the world. And I think, this is very much informed by Peter Godfrey Smith's work. I like a lot of Mark Solms's work, how consciousness as an allostatic control mechanism for an organism to feel its way through a hard problem. I like that framing. And it seems to me plausible that this happened very, very early on, as these very early organisms started to sense the environment, make meaning from that stimuli, and then start weighing up decisions like, okay, this chemical gradient over here, response, it means food. This chemical gradient over here means that there was a predator last time. And then it starts to build a memory. And then as the organism integrates those features, I think integrated information is key. In my view at the moment, although a lot of people have pointed out that they don't like this, that's where feeling emerges. It's extremely early on. So I'm, all the way to bacteria are conscious, plants are conscious, because they're integrating information about their environment. And that is what subjectivity is. And we have this incredibly rich subjective sense of consciousness because we're integrating billions of factors all into this one self-referential generative model. It's encapsulating so much, and that's why we have all these rich models, but it goes the whole way down the domain of life, and they have experience because the features that they are integrating into their subjective self. Does that make sense to you? I'm really curious on what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I think I've heard that described, your position, as a kind of biopsychism. So it's not all the way to panpsychism, but consciousness and life are coextensive in some sense. And that instead of looking at complex nervous systems for some kind of causal story about how consciousness emerges, we should be looking at single cells, not brains, but membranes. And I think that's that's a positive direction for the uh, research program of consciousness studies to move in. Absolutely, I'm really deeply influenced by people like Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson, and this kind of autopoietic and enactive approach to these questions,
Right.
where, as Evan Thompson phrases it, there's a mind-life continuity. He calls it the mind-life continuity thesis. And so as soon as you have a living cell that's self-producing, you have a kind of what they would call operational closure. You're referring to the capacity to integrate information. And these aren't identical understandings, but they're in the same ballpark. Um, then you have as soon as you have that operational closure, in their terms, that self-producing dynamic, where you have a system whose parts produce themselves for the sake of a whole, then you have an interior horizon of experience. You have a sort of hedonic gradients and a sense of yum and yuck, right? Like, and this, I think, there's clearly at the level of cellular life, once you get biological organisms as we understand them here on this planet, there's a new threshold that's been crossed.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel